The lights of the Fairmont Chateau Laurier ballroom caught every crystal on the chandeliers and threw them back across 500 faces, and not one of those faces was looking at the stage anymore. They were all looking at the woman who had just walked through the doors. Vivian Cole had chosen her dress the way she chose everything. With precision. Midnight blue structured at the shoulder, falling clean to the floor without a single unnecessary detail. No statement necklace, no clutch covered in sequins, nothing that said look at me because she didn't need it to. She'd spent 11 years being the quietest person in every room her husband walked into, and she was finished with that now. The room did not go quiet the way it does in movies. The orchestra kept playing, the servers kept moving, but there was a current that ran through the crowd, a small electric thing, because standing at the far end of the room with his arm around a woman who was not his wife was Ronan Cole, chief strategy officer of the firm that bore her family's name, and his face had just drained of every drop of color it contained. Vivian had not come to make a scene. She'd come to collect what was hers. It had started 4 months earlier with a phone call she almost didn't take. She'd been at her studio on Spark Street, the one she'd built from a single client and 17 years of obsessive craft into one of the most respected interior design practices in Ottawa. The light was good that afternoon, low and golden through the west-facing windows, and she was reviewing the material specifications for a federal government contract, the kind of project her firm had spent a decade earning the right to bid on. The kind of project that required her entire attention, which was why she almost sent the unknown number to voicemail. She answered it on the 4th ring. Is this Vivian Cole? It is. My name isn't important, but what I'm going to tell you is, she nearly hung up. Anonymous tips were for people in thrillers, not for women in their late 30s with stone samples on their desk and a meeting in an hour, but something in the caller's voice, a flatness, a deliberateness, made her stay on the line. Your husband has been billing personal expenses through the Cole Interiors client accounts, hotels, dinners, flights, for the past 14 months. The line hummed. 14 months, Vivian said. Check the Meridian account, the miscellaneous entertainment line. The caller hung up. Vivian sat very still for 30 seconds. Then she opened the accounting software she'd largely handed off to Ronan 2 years ago, when the firm's growth had made it too much to manage alone, when trusting him with the business side had seemed like the natural evolution of a partnership. She found the Meridian account. She found the miscellaneous entertainment line. She found $47,000 she could not explain. Her assistant knocked and told her the meeting had arrived early. Vivian closed the laptop, smoothed her blazer and walked into the boardroom with a smile that revealed nothing, because she had spent 11 years learning how to do exactly that. She'd met Ronan at a design conference in Vancouver when she was 26 and he was 31, still finishing his MVA, full of the kind of easy confidence that reads as competence until you've known someone long enough to understand the difference. He had ideas. She had vision. He could walk into a room and have everyone convinced within 10 minutes. And in those early years, that combination felt like the missing piece she hadn't known she needed. They built Cole Interiors together, though together was a word that had always required some translation. Vivian designed. She sourced materials, cultivated relationships with craftspeople and suppliers, pitched impossible concepts to skeptical clients and then delivered on them so precisely that the clients came back and sent their colleagues. Ronan handled the business development, contracts, partnerships, the public-facing work of maintaining a reputation she'd already established. He was good at it. She'd never disputed that. She'd just failed to notice until very recently that every door he'd walked through had been one she'd built. She didn't confront him right away. She hired an accountant who owed her a favor and asked for a quiet audit. She gave it 2 weeks. When the results came back, the number had grown. $63,000 over 14 months, carefully distributed across 4 client accounts in amounts small enough not to trigger automatic flags. Hotels she'd never stayed in, restaurants she'd never visited, a return flight to Toronto she'd never taken. She cross-referenced the dates against Ronan's calendar, which she still had access to because it had never occurred to either of them that she'd ever need to check it. The Toronto flight fell on a weekend he'd told her he was at a golf retreat in Collingwood with clients from the McGrath account. The McGrath account had, according to their own records, no client entertainment filed for that weekend. She found the woman's name in his email. He'd been careless, or maybe he'd stopped caring. She'd learn later it was a bit of both. Her name was Tara. She was an events coordinator at a hotel chain, young, easy to look at, unattached to the complicated architecture of a shared life. Their emails went back 16 months. The first one began with a familiarity that told Vivian. This had not been a slow escalation. She read everything, took screenshots, forwarded them to a folder on a cloud drive Ronan didn't know about. Then she called her lawyer. Patricia Osi was the kind of lawyer who didn't offer sympathy because she understood that sympathy wasn't what clients actually needed. What they needed was strategy. She met with Vivian on a Thursday morning and laid out the situation with the clinical economy of someone who had navigated dozens of these. He's a partner in the firm, Patricia said. That complicates the asset picture. He's a minority partner. 30%. I retained majority control when we restructured. Does he know that? Vivian looked at her. He signed the documents. People sign documents they don't fully read. He read them. He negotiated 2 of the clauses. Vivian paused. He understood the structure. He just assumed it wouldn't matter. Patricia made a note. The financial irregularities give us leverage. Depending on how aggressive you want to be, we could pursue repayment, or we could use it as a counterweight in the partnership dissolution. I want the firm clean. My name on it, my work in it, no ongoing entanglement. Then we'll need to move carefully. He'll claim equal contribution to the firm's growth. Let him. Vivian was not by nature a vengeful person. She'd learned early that anger was a resource, and like any resource, it was most useful when directed precisely. She wasn't angry at Tara. She wasn't even entirely angry at Ronan. She was angry at the particular architecture of the betrayal, the patience it had required, the deliberateness, the fact that while she had been delivering on impossible deadlines, he had been quietly planning an exit that would take half of what she'd built. She started the reconstruction quietly. She reached out to every major client directly. Not to say anything about the marriage. She never mentioned it. She talked about the firm's upcoming direction, about projects she was excited about her vision for the next 5 years. She was reminding them, without stating it, who they had actually hired, which name on the Cole Interiors letterhead corresponded to the work they'd received. Most of them already knew. That was the thing about relationships built on consistent delivery. They didn't require maintenance the way Ronan's networking did. The clients knew who'd been on site at midnight solving the problem. They knew whose eye had caught the flaw in the tile pattern before installation. They'd always known. She also stopped disappearing. For years she'd let Ronan be the face of things. Galas, industry events, the annual Ottawa Design Awards dinner. She'd attended as his wife, present but peripheral, content to let him work the room while she thought about load-bearing walls and custom millwork specifications. She hadn't enjoyed it. She was better in a room with 3 people than a room with 300. But she accepted every invitation that arrived in November. Every panel discussion, every keynote request, every media inquiry she'd been quietly declining for 2 years. She showed up and she talked about her work with the specificity of someone who had actually done it, and people leaned forward. The Design Industry Association of Canada named her to their annual recognition list in mid-November. She hadn't submitted her own name. A colleague had put her forward. The announcement landed quietly, an industry newsletter item, but the response was immediate and specific. Congratulations from clients, from suppliers, from architects she'd collaborated with over the years. A brief, warm mention from a journalist who covered the Ottawa design scene. Ronan sent her a text that said congrats, well deserved. She did not respond. His lawyer had sent her lawyer a settlement proposal in October. It was ambitious. 50% of the firm's assets, ongoing royalties from any projects initiated during the partnership, and compensation for what the document called his instrumental role in building client relationships that drove firm revenue. Vivian read it twice, then set it on her desk next to the audit report. She'd expected the proposal. What she hadn't expected was the article. It appeared in a local business profile column, one of those quarterly features on Ottawa entrepreneurs. And Ronan had given the interview without telling her. She found out from a colleague who'd seen the online preview. She read it on her phone standing in the kitchen of her apartment, and something cold settled into her chest and stayed there. He was charming in the article. He always was. He talked about the challenges of running a creative firm, about balancing artistic vision with business reality, about what he'd brought to Cole Interiors over 11 years. He didn't say she was difficult. He said she was singularly focused, that her commitment to design sometimes came at the cost of the broader relationship building that sustains a business. He said he'd worn many hats she didn't have bandwidth for. He expressed admiration for her talent while making it perfectly clear, to anyone paying attention, that the firm's success had required someone like him to make her work accessible to the world. The journalist had asked about the separation. He'd called it a mutual recognition that their partnership had run its course. He'd mentioned briefly that he was exploring a new venture with a collaborator who brings a different kind of energy. The coffee mug she set down on the counter landed harder than she intended. She understood now that he'd been doing this for months. Small comments at industry events, a carefully worded quote here, a podcast appearance there. He'd been constructing his version of events before hers could exist, and he'd done it while she was finishing the federal contract, while she was managing a team of 12, while she was, as he had so precisely put it, focused elsewhere. She called Patricia that afternoon. How much of the financial misconduct can we use publicly? In court, all of it. Publicly, we have to be careful. Defamation cuts both ways. I don't want to defame him, I want the truth to be available. Patricia was quiet for a moment. There's a difference between releasing information and allowing information to be found. If a journalist asks the right questions and we point them toward public records, the audit is a business document. It's not confidential. No, it isn't. Vivian had lunch that week with a journalist she'd known for 6 years, a woman who wrote about business and culture for a national outlet and who had, on 3 separate occasions, asked Vivian for an interview she'd declined. She didn't give the interview. She didn't mention Ronan's name or the audit or the article. She talked about the federal project, about what it meant for the firm's future, about the design philosophy she'd developed over 17 years. At the end of lunch, she mentioned casually that she'd recently commissioned a comprehensive audit of the firm's finances in preparation for a restructure, and that the findings had been clarifying. The journalist called Patricia's office 2 days later with a records request. The settlement negotiations had grown ugly by early December. The way these things do when both sides have stopped pretending civility is possible. Ronan's lawyer, a man named Jeffrey who communicated in a tone of aggressive patience, had escalated the royalty claim and added an assertion that Vivian's management style had created conditions that effectively pushed Ronan toward alternative professional arrangements. The phrase was elegant in its cowardice. The meeting was held in a boardroom in the Byward Market, neutral ground, and Vivian arrived 8 minutes early with Patricia and a paralegal carrying 3 accordion folders. Ronan arrived with Jeffrey and a quiet, well-dressed accountant whose purpose became clear within the first 15 minutes. He'd had his own valuation done. It attributed to him a percentage of the firm's creative output, strategic input on design direction, the document called it, and placed a dollar figure on 11 years of what Vivian could only describe as adjacency. Your client, Patricia said in the particular tone she reserved for moments like this, is claiming credit for design decisions he did not make based on his presence in a building where someone else was making them. Jeffrey smiled. Collaboration is rarely so cleanly delineated. When it's documented, it is. Patricia opened the first folder. The documentation was thorough. Every major project had a paper trail, and every paper trail led to Vivian. The original concepts, the specification sheets, the site communications, the problem-solving notes from late nights when contractors couldn't execute a detail and she'd driven in to figure out why. Her signature on everything that mattered, Ronan's on the client contracts, which was exactly what their respective roles had always been. Ronan looked at the folders and his expression went somewhere she hadn't seen before. Not guilt, something more complicated. The look of a man realizing the ground he'd thought was solid had been built by someone else and could be reclaimed. I built the client relationships, he said, and it was the first time he'd spoken directly to her. You maintained them, Vivian said. After I established them. With clients who came to us because of my work. There's a distinction, you're being reductive, I'm being accurate. She looked at him steadily. You want half of everything I built, I'm telling you what you actually built, which was access. You had access to my work, my reputation and my network. That has value, but it doesn't have a 50% value. Jeffrey cleared his throat. Perhaps we could discuss a compromise figure. We can, Patricia said. Our compromise figure is 20% of liquid assets, no ongoing royalties, no IP transfer, and full repayments of the $63,000 in misappropriated client account funds. The room went quiet. Jeffrey looked at the accountant looked at his hands, Ronan looked at Vivian. You had me investigated. I had our business audited. Standard practice when a partner exits. She kept her voice level. The findings were what they were. That money was legitimate business development. 14 months of hotels and dinners and a flight to Toronto for a weekend. You told me you were in Collingwood. Charged to client accounts that were not associated with any of those activities. She tilted her head slightly. Jeffrey, would you like me to table the full audit report or would you prefer to take a short recess? Jeffrey chose the recess. In the hallway, Patricia stood beside her and said nothing for a moment. You did well, she finally offered. I kept my voice down. That's all I managed. That's everything. They went back in. Jeffrey made a counter-proposal. 28%, no royalties, partial repayment of the funds on a payment schedule. Patricia countered. The conversation continued for 2 more hours, methodical and precise. 2 lawyers negotiating the price of a mistake Ronan had spent 14 months making. Vivian sat through all of it and did not look at her watch. She did not look at her watch because she was keeping something in reserve, a piece of information she hadn't deployed yet, that Zara Osei, no relation to Patricia, had found 2 weeks earlier while doing what Vivian had asked her to do, which was find out who Tara actually was. Zara was a researcher who worked in due diligence, the kind of work that required patience and a willingness to follow things to their unremarkable ends. She'd found several ends, none of them particularly unremarkable. Tara had worked at 3 hotel properties in the past 6 years, always in event coordination, always adjacent to well-positioned men in creative or professional fields, and 2 of those men had subsequently left their wives, lost portions of their businesses in the process, and hired Tara into consulting roles she'd leveraged for industry access she wouldn't have had otherwise. It wasn't illegal. It was, Vivian thought, almost impressively systematic. Ronan had been recruited the way a good property developer recruits a neighborhood, slowly, with apparent sincerity, in a way that looked like love until you saw the pattern. She hadn't used this in the settlement meeting. She didn't need to, but she would use it tonight if necessary, because tonight was the Chateau Laurier Gala, and Ronan would be there with Tara, and Vivian had been invited in her own right for the first time. As a recognition honoree, one of 10 design professionals acknowledged annually by the Capital Arts Foundation. She hadn't planned to go initially. Her publicist, a pragmatic woman named Jules who'd been nudging Vivian toward visibility for years, had sat across from her in November and said, "You can let him occupy your spaces or you can occupy them first. Those are the options." Vivian had looked at the invitation and thought about the Chateau Laurier, the hotel's landmark renovation 15 years ago, the structural challenges of the East Wing that the original architects had puzzled over until a then 24-year-old design assistant named Vivian had proposed a solution in a meeting where no one had asked for her opinion. The solution was still holding up the East Wing. She had more right to be in that building than almost anyone in the room tonight. The dress was midnight blue. The shoes were practical enough to stand in for 4 hours. She'd worn her hair up because she worked better with her face unobstructed, and she'd stopped making choices to look softer in photographs. She walked through the Chateau Laurier's grand entrance alone. Photographers were there. Arts galas attracted a certain level of documentation, and she felt their cameras find her, heard the low murmur of recognition that moved through the nearest cluster of guests. She accepted a glass of wine from a server and took stock of the room. She saw Ronan within 2 minutes. He was near the east windows with a group of people she recognized from the city's development community, his posture easy, his smile doing the work it had always done. Tara was beside him. She was younger than Vivian had imagined and older than she'd feared, dressed in something that demanded attention without quite earning it. Ronan's hand rested at the small of her back with practiced ease. He hadn't seen Vivian yet. She turned away and spent the next hour being exactly who she was. She talked to an architect she'd collaborated with on a Gatineau project 3 years ago, who wanted to discuss a new museum commission. She spoke with the foundation's director about the honoree's remarks. A journalist she'd never met asked her about the federal contract, and she explained the spatial logic of the design with the fluency of someone who had lived inside the problem. A young designer from Carleton asked her how she'd gotten her start, and she told the truth. 1 client, 1 project, 17 years of refusing to deliver anything she wasn't proud of. The recognition portion of the evening began at 9. The foundation's chair spoke briefly, then introduced each honoree. Vivian's citation mentioned Cole Interiors, the federal contract, and she hadn't known this was coming. The East Wing renovation, which a board member had apparently researched and found in the project archives. The chair said, "What some of you may not know is that the structural solution that preserved this building's East Wing during the 2008 renovation was proposed by tonight's honoree. If you've spent any time in that wing this evening, you've experienced her work firsthand." The applause was warm and immediate. Vivian stood, accepted it, and did not look at Ronan Cole. She didn't need to. She could feel from across the room the particular quality of his stillness. The evening continued. More conversations, more connections, the gradual compression of a night that had asked a great deal of her into something that felt, by 10 o'clock, almost manageable. She was speaking with the museum architect when she sensed him behind her. "Vivian." She finished her sentence to the architect, excused herself briefly, and turned. Ronan looked the way he always looked in formal clothes, composed, handsome, every inch the person he'd decided to be, but there was something around his eyes that hadn't been there before, a tightness. "I didn't think you were coming," he said. "I was invited. The recognition is well deserved." She said nothing. He shifted slightly. "The East Wing thing. I didn't know you'd worked on that. You never asked." The tightness around his eyes deepened. "Jeffrey called this afternoon. He thinks we're close to an agreement." "Good. Patricia will handle it." "Vivian." He lowered his voice. "I didn't want it to be like this." She looked at him for a moment. Not with anger. She'd moved past the place where anger lived and into something quieter, something that didn't require his participation. You made a series of choices over 14 months that were completely deliberate. The manner in which they've unfolded is a consequence of those choices. It being like this is exactly what you chose. I know I hurt you. Yes. She picked up her wine. You did. She turned to find Tara standing 3 feet away, which was closer than Vivian had expected. I think, Tara said carefully, that we got off on the wrong foot. Vivian studied her, young, direct, not without intelligence, prepared for a different kind of woman than the one in front of her. I'm not sure we're on any foot at all, Vivian said. You made a choice that affected my life significantly. I don't harbor any particular feeling about that beyond the factual recognition that it happened. She paused. I do think you should know that Ronan began meeting with a business attorney about separating his new venture's assets from any future collaboration, before you'd agreed to the terms of that collaboration. Patricia found the billing records last week. Tara's expression shifted. I'm not telling you that to be unkind, Vivian continued. I'm telling you because I spent 11 years not knowing things I should have known, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone. She looked at Ronan, who had gone very still. I hope the new venture is everything you're both planning on. She walked away, through the crowd, past the bar, through the doors and out into the December night, where the Rideau Canal was frozen and the city was quiet under a low sky. Her phone buzzed. Jules, who had been monitoring the evening from a healthy distance. You were extraordinary. The Foundation Board is talking. A national outlet wants an interview tomorrow. Vivian typed back, set it up. Patricia's message arrived 4 minutes later. Ronan's lawyer called. He's willing to accept 22%. No royalties. Full repayment on a 12-month schedule. 22% of what she'd built. Less than she'd been prepared to give. A number she could accept and close and move past. She looked up at the Chateau Laurier's east wing. The windows lit, the stone solid. A wall that was standing because a 24-year-old had understood its load-bearing logic in a room full of people who hadn't thought to ask her. She typed back to Patricia, accept it. Let's be done. She stood outside for a few minutes longer, breathing in the cold Ottawa air, watching the canal. She had a proposal to finish for a gallery in Montreal, a concept she'd been turning over for 3 weeks, a client in Vancouver who'd reached out after seeing the recognition announcement, and the federal contract, her contract, bearing down on a March deadline that she was going to hit the way she hit every deadline, because she had always delivered, and that was not a thing Ronan Cole could claim credit for or take away. The museum architect found her outside, apologized for interrupting, and said he'd been trying to get her attention for 20 minutes because his client had asked specifically for her. She listened to what he had to say, then she said yes. She went back inside, not for Ronan, not to prove anything to anyone in that room, but because the work was in there and the work was hers and she had stopped apologizing for taking up the space it required. 4 months after the gala, Cole Interiors dropped the Cole and became Vivian Marsh Design. The name change wasn't a statement, it was just accurate. It reflected, at last, who had been doing the work all along. The Montreal Gallery opened in September. Vivian stood in front of it on the morning of the unveiling and read her name on the placard beside the entrance. Not a partnership, not a shared credit. Her name, her vision, the place where 11 years of precision and 18-hour days, and the particular kind of stubbornness it takes to solve a problem everyone else has given up on had finally been given their right shape. She'd heard, through the quiet channels of a small industry in a smaller city, that Ronan's new venture had stalled, that a significant client had withdrawn after asking for design samples Ronan couldn't produce, that Tara had moved on to a different firm, a different city, with a new set of connections to build from. She felt nothing about this that she could easily name. Something adjacent to recognition, perhaps. The understanding that a thing built on borrowed credibility will eventually have to support its own weight. She'd designed buildings that would stand for 100 years. She'd designed a life, finally, that she didn't have to share with anyone who didn't deserve it. The work was ongoing, the foundation was hers. That, it turned out, was enough, and far more than she'd had when she was simply half of something that was never as equal as it appeared.